To begin, I'd like to just welcome and introduce my panelists. So I'm going to obviously say welcome, and if you could tell just a little bit about who you are, what you do, and your company, of course. Christy, you want to start?
Sure. My name is Christy King. I'm the Vice President of Technology Research and Development for Zuffa, which is the parent company of several brands, but the most well-known one, of course, is the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. I kind of oversee, our company has chosen not to bring on staff a lot of technology people. We tend to use tons and tons and tons of third parties, lots of developer houses that have specialized in all sorts of different applications and problem solving efforts. So we kind of tend to make relationships with those sorts of development houses and keep them working with us for often several years in a row. So I oversee about the equivalent of 65 full-time software and hardware engineers to do all sorts of our worldwide technology applications. So that is one of the things that I do, but most relevant to today.
Excellent. Thanks, Christy. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Liu, CEO and co-founder of Buddy TV. Been around since 2005. We're rethinking the whole TV guide experience. And if you're anything like me, when you get home at night at 8 p.m., you sit down to watch TV, you turn on your TV guide from your pay TV provider and you scroll through hundreds of channels, and then if you don't find anything there, you go on to On Demand. If you don't find anything there, you go on to what's on your DVR. If you don't find anything there, you jump on Amazon, Netflix, iTunes, Hulu. What we do is we actually compile all that together and index it for you, try to find something great to watch. What we found is most people take 8 to 10 minutes to find something to watch, and 70% of the time they end up watching Karate Kid 3 for the 11th time in commercials, in SD, halfway through when the DVD's in the back room. We try to make sure that that doesn't happen to folks that are watching TV.
Awesome. Alan?
Okay, I'm Alan Wolk. I am the global lead analyst at Kit Digital. We are a middleware company, which basically means we take one piece of software, make sure it works with the other piece. We do a lot of work for the big MVPDs like AT&T Uverse, Sky TV in England. We also have a second screen product that we just rolled out called 2SI, which is a white label middleware product that's aimed at networks and MVPDs that basically creates a standard platform, and it's a mashup of a program guide with any kind of social second screen functionality. So,
Awesome.
we do.
Awesome. Thanks, Alan. All right, so, and also in my role, the Second Screen Society is a group of not only technology providing companies, but also content advisors across. On the content advisor side, it's across 4 major categories: studios, obviously making movies, television networks, broadcast networks. We also have the league, so Joe Inzerillo is one of our advisors who was on the previous panel. And then, of course, ad agencies. We probably will extend to brands eventually, but for right now, we're really working with the people who are working with those brands and trying to hone their messages in the new media world. So the difference with us, with the Second Screen Society, as opposed to something like a streaming media trade association, is we're really focused on the engagement experience, which differentiates, I think, from a couple of the phenomena that are happening now. Just really quickly to just level set with the crowd. So how many people are familiar and feel like they know what they're talking about around second screen? All right, yeah, about half and half. How many are just putting their first toe in the water? Okay, all right, because we can get into the weeds really quick. We live and breathe this stuff all the time. I'm going to start out with a question, but I'd like to also make sure that I get the definitions for the people, right? So we see social TV, right, the tweeting, checking in, that whole social media integration with television as its own bucket. And then we see multi-screen, which is basically TV everywhere, the idea that you can take a piece of content on the go with you. Maybe it picks up when you're back at home. But then when we talk about second screen, it's specifically around engagement experiences. Companies like ZBox, Vigil, Buddy TV from a discovery perspective. So my first question to you guys, that's just a level set in terms of those terms. So when we say social TV and multi-screen, you guys know what we're talking about. But let's talk about this whole thing. Do you guys, do you or your companies, do you guys see any major differences between those 3 approaches? And maybe talking a little bit about how the consumer interacts with each of those pieces. Alan, you want to start?
Yeah,
And we'll move down towards Chris.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things about second screen TV is that people do tend to think of it as just being social. It's just, it's Twitter. And that's not really the case at all. So we've identified 4 different areas of second screen experience. So there is social, which is Twitter and Facebook. The next one is, it's 4 S's. The next one is stats, which is literally just statistics, any kind of poll, any interactive experience like that. The third one is stories, so which can be anything from scenes from next week to additional content that you have around the show, to interviews with actors and actresses, fan fiction, anything that sort of extends the story. And then the 4th S is shopping, because T-commerce is going to be part of that big second screen experience. So right now, social is the most developed just because Twitter has the largest user base. But flip of that is Twitter, according to the last Pew study I read, has a 15% install base among adults, of which 8% use it on a daily basis. So that means you don't reach 92% of your population that way. Twitter has effect way beyond its numbers, but it's still we think it's eventually going to wind up being a much smaller piece of the pie than things like stats and stories.
I mean, by the way, just to follow up, it's interesting you say, it's about Twitter users, but it's also something that's evolved, over years. And from an educational perspective of people getting up and, trying out their first apps on their iPhone or their tablet or smartphone, right? Those are where you gravitate to. Oh, I'm a regular Foursquare person, or I'm a Yelp person, right? I understand that whole idea around it. Anything you guys want to add on top of that from that whole differentiation perspective? Because you're seen as a very social EPG.
Yeah. So a couple of things. I think there's a lot of agreement with folks that the second screen is a really, really interesting space, primarily because most people do have a second screen literally when they're watching TV. And some of the most basic implementations of second screen were basic check-ins. And these are when you see a show on TV, you can actually check in and you can share it with your network. What we found is that is, in terms of engagement, not super engaging, because over time you kind of get tired of this whole check-in thing. And so what are the engaging experiences that you can create? And I think the 4 S's were a good compilation of that. The way that we think about it is number one is there's not much innovation around discovery, and so the opportunity to really innovate around discovery is a great way to engage people, to find content that's really relevant, especially in an environment where there's just so much content available, whether it's on demand or linear TV or streaming. But the great thing beyond that is, what are the augmented experiences that really drive people to dive deeper into the content that they love? For example, if you're watching Grey's Anatomy, what are the certain things that you can provide to an end user that doesn't require them to go and do a search for Grey's Anatomy to find out who that character was and to dive deeper into that story? Perhaps you are a couple of episodes back, and so how do you catch up? How do you interact and know a little bit deeper about the backstory of this specific character? So all those experiences can be developed, and we call those kind of augmented content experiences, things that we think really drive engagement for users. So between those two areas, we think that there's a lot of innovation that will occur in the next couple of years.
Well, it's interesting. You're also talking about the difference between the fan, right? You have the casual user versus the super fan, right? Christy, talk about super fans, right?
Yes.
I mean, I don't think as extreme as some of the UFC fans that are out there.
Yes.
What do you take into considerations when you're designing these second screen experiences? Also taking a look at those 3 pieces that we're talking
In
about.
a lot of ways, we kind of really understand the engagement piece of that and why that's compelling, not just for our fans to give them content that's interesting or compelling or different or new, but there's a lot of things that we have access to that we would like to share with our fans, but there really isn't a way to do that through pay-per-view. I mean, it's just a screen. You turn it on, you watch it. That's, our fan tends to range anywhere from pretty young teens all the way up into, on average, into 30s and 40s. Those are people, for the most part, that are extremely comfortable with technology, and they all have some kind of little whiz-bang gadget in their pockets. So we see it as a way to put information in front of the super rabid fans. They want to know more about that guy that's fighting, kind of much like the Grey's Anatomy, more, deeper, more information. But really, the more powerful tool for us has been, we already know from research that the biggest conversion that happens to people who become more serious fans of mixed martial arts are those who actually experience it for the first few times in bars with their friends. And the reason that is, we think, from what we can tell, is that people are talking about the sport. So what's happening? Why are they on the ground? Why aren't they making them stand up? You know, if you're a boxing fan, that looks weird. So somebody needs to tell you what's going on. The second screen experience really becomes our ability to kind of do a better job giving good information to people that don't understand what they're watching, and we can teach them in kind of this less, you know, it's not a classroom setting, that's kind of this really interesting, or, you know, you can do it quietly so your buddies can't see you. I don't know what a whatever choke is. You can look it up and then not feel like you don't understand what you're looking at. So for us, it's a huge education piece of it. Works really well.
And what, do you think it's the booze? Let's be honest. I'm kidding. In terms of locations also, we're trying to have fun here, so please. In terms of locations, I mean, do you see other patterns in terms of where, you basically have kind of a TV everywhere element from a clip perspective. You have a little bit of a social thing in terms of Twitters and interactions there. And then you've got this engagement experience where you can learn more about it. But, when you look at your fans and look at what they're doing, is this something where it's a convenient thing for them to do, or are they totally in and glued to the set and it's like, I have blocked my calendar 4 hours for, this guy versus that guy fight?
We try to provide content for both and everybody in between. I mean, we really see that there's 3 different ways that people experience the sport. They're either in the arena, and your second screen experience is going to be different in arena than it is if you're in a bar where you can't hear, because no bars ever turn on the audio. Mm-hmm. So if you want to hear or understand what's going on, that's another thing that you can provide through a second screen experience. Or if they're at home, that's a whole nother experience altogether. Maybe the social becomes really important because maybe you're there with just yourself or a couple other friends, and you kind of want to see that big fan feedback. So that loop may become more interesting than us providing blue corner, what we call blue corner, red corner audio for those people that are in the venue. So our app that's actually being released in a couple weeks absolutely blew out all the technology from several other versions we've done. It's a complete revamp acknowledging all 3 of those audience segments. So we really are offering something different to somebody that's in the venue. We're doing things like geolocation, things like that to tell where they are, provide a different experience than somebody who's in a bar, than somebody who's at home. And it's the same app, everybody downloads the same thing, but we know we need to provide different things to you depending on where you are.
I think that, the other thing that emphasizes also the idea of a second screen experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the living room, right?
Right,
A
absolutely.
scoreboard at a venue can be a second screen.
Absolutely.
That whole idea of automatic content recognition, ACR, right? Mm-hmm. So wherever you are, whether it's video, whether it's audio, or whether it's fingerprinted as it comes down the pipe, that experience can be there. We also see a big impact also at retail, right? That whole idea of you're at an end cap for UFC, you can take a snapshot of it. We've seen NFL do that as well.
Yep.
Andy, all right, so talking about the discovery process and engaging that fan everywhere, right? Recommendations and quick lists are obviously the big piece that drives your engagement from your user. How has this evolved over the last 18 months? Is this and also, as a sidebar, do you see is it mostly happening in the living room, or do you see people on the subway like checking out things that they want to watch? The idea of having a TV guide on the go. I didn't. Really interesting.
Yeah, so a couple of points there. One is the recommendation side is one of the parts that's really, really fun, because most people actually are so used to having to figure out, hey, I remember now TBS is on channel 664 and ESPN is on 900 and so forth, and that's how they think, and you always think of the grid as kind of the only way to be able to access content. And now what we've really tried to evolve over the last 18, 24 months is to figure out what signals really make sense for the end user to be able to quickly get into content that's really interesting at that given point in time. So just to give you a sense of some of those signals, some of the basic ones are what shows have you watched in the past, and what shows have you said are your favorite? And then what are some of the things that when we recommend to you that you flip right through and you don't ever even look at it a second time? Those are all signals as to things that are interesting to you and also not interesting to you. But we also take in social signals, because a lot of times what's interesting is those folks, that water cooler conversation happens at work and so forth, are about live TV the night before. And so some of the signals around what your friends are watching can be an indicator of what might be interesting for you to watch, so you can be a part of that conversation. So as recommendations evolve, we found that we get better and better over time, and so we are able to get you into something quickly to watch. Now, how does this apply between kind of living room and outside of the living room, I think is really interesting. Is inside a living room, a lot of times right now, the main use case is that you really want to focus on that primary screen. And so when that primary screen is on, now you've got a second screen that can handle, and I'm going to dive a little bit deeper, three more use cases. So once you've decided what you're going to watch, there's a pre-show experience. So how do you get engaged with folks that are just about to start watching American Idol? And then there's a during the show experience. What are the private viewing parties? What are the social elements that can happen during the show when you're watching the show? And then really important is the post-show experience. We saw this all the time with a show called Lost. There's an immediate spike in interest from folks that want to know what everybody else thought about what just happened, because there's just too many questions. And the goal of that part, post-show experience, is really to get people engaged and spark conversation after the show, because a lot of times those shows, there's a little bit less conversation during the show experience. Now, when you go on the road with what we've built, is we know what shows that you have been watching. We've been tracking that the whole time, and now you can use it on the road to be able to catch up as well. And so now you can be able to catch up on Amazon, on Netflix, on Hulu. You can actually go from our app and immediately deep link and start consuming that content. After you watch that content, come back and then engage back into the community as well. So then that becomes your primary use case, is actually during the show you're watching the show and engage with the show.
You know, it's interesting because you're also speaking to the whole data side of it, right? It's ironic that we have a big data conference going on in the other room, right? But when you start thinking about, the data that you had to deal with in the past, right, versus the amount of data when you talk about 3 use cases underneath a major subcase, and then you could branch that off and tree it out. Where do you think that whole idea is going? I mean, from a UFC perspective, right? That data also drives things like spoiler alerts, and right, the whole idea is you don't want a tweet on there if somebody's watching a recast or of a piece or a clip that says, oh, hey, this person won. How do you guys deal with that whole phenomenon on the whole fan side, right, and not spoiling things?
Well, you get yelled at just as much for not saying what happened as you do for saying what happened.
It's the old damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
So, there's a reason everything starts with spoiler alert, because it could be, this is horrible, but I watched Heroes for the first time 6 months ago.
Okay, all right.
A little slow
on the
uptake
uptake there.
there.
Yeah, that's all right.
But I just finally got around to it. So, of course, luckily for me, it had been so long since anybody watched it, nobody spoiled anything for me. But for most, especially for us, whether we're doing Ultimate Fighter, which is a reality show, and the fights that happen in those shows are pre-recorded, but barely, we spend a lot of time and effort trying to keep that information contained. But really the key of it is when you get to the pay-per-view show, that really is a relatively small segment of people that actually buy it and watch it. We would love for it to be everyone, but that's just not how the world works. So really there's a massive amount of traffic hitting our website starting as soon as that's over Saturday into Sunday, especially worldwide, because our show is live about 3 o'clock in the morning for most of Western Europe. They're not watching this thing at 3 in the morning. They're going to watch it at the bar the next day, or they'll watch a replay. But they still want to know, a lot of them, who won, how did it go, whatever, because they're trying to say, is it worth going to XYZ to go watch it and find out about it? So it's not a giveaway for those. So in other words, the point is really, for your data purpose, you can't say this is the right thing to do and this is the wrong thing to do. Everybody consumes media differently, and you just have to put it out there with as much caveat around it to make sure it's clear what people are getting into, and then let people consume media how they want to consume it.
There's an interesting sidebar to that, is that there's a lot of stats that the amount of social chatter around TV shows is considerably less on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast. because they know if they open up Twitter or
what
Facebook,
happened.
their friends in New York are going to have already told them what happened, so they just avoid it. But it's a sizable drop off. I forget the actual numbers, but it's more than 10 or 20%.
Yep.
It also speaks to binge viewing as well, right? So
It's a huge phenomenon.
It's a huge phenomenon, all right, and it's recent, right? I mean, this, you maybe would do it with some DVD box sets like Lord of the Rings or something like that, but binging on Lost or something like that. I mean, the idea with a new viewer, right? If you know they're a new viewer, or you can see that pattern, then you can start saying, okay, even giving them the option. I think that's also giving them the option to turn off the tweets around that particular episode, or even with an American Idol, right? You don't want to give it away if somebody's watching it on a DVR. How do you guys deal with that internally at Buddy TV? Is it something that I mean, curation is a big part of your business.
It is. And we actually have a full editorial staff at Buddy TV. The way that we think about it is that with the phenomenon around binge viewing, we want to make sure that it feels as if you're watching it live at that point in time. And so if you are watching Game of Thrones last season, episode 3, you're not going to get a bunch of articles about 4, 5, and 6 and spoilers. What you're going to get is a pre-show experience when you're watching 3, kind of recapping 1 and 2, and then you also get what to look forward to in that episode, perhaps some Easter eggs that you might want to take a look at, and then also kind of quotes and so forth, things that you would enjoy after watching the show. And so the goal is that we've actually done all the matching of the IDs specifically for that episode, so you have that great experience as you're watching that episode, but you're not going to get spoiled for future episodes. And that's how we've actually built it out across all the content we do have.
Awesome. All right, back on topic, right? This whole in-home, out-of-home, companion versus convenience discussion. Do you think this is a global phenomenon? I mean, you mentioned obviously your European viewers, right? You've got a global fan base around there, and or do you think we're driving it based on our broadcast model? Because obviously our broadcast model is very different to Europe, right? Where you've got a lot of publics and it's country by country. Do you see this as as being U.S. led?
Well, actually, we tend to lag behind Europe in a lot of ways, actually. I mean, one of the more obvious ones, which I'm always shocked that we haven't instituted here, and I think Time Warner has started to do it, is the notion of catch-up TV, which is basically taking all the stuff that currently exists on the US MVPDs, on VOD, and putting it back into the grid, so that if I go back to yesterday and I see, I missed the season finale of The Office, I can just press play and it'll show up. But I find it through the grid rather than going back into the VOD, which for almost every MVPD is just this horrifying mess of a UX where you can never find anything. Even easier than that is play from start, which I think would eliminate a lot of the reason why people go to Netflix and Hulu. And what's that? It's just basically, it's 9:15. I missed the first 15 minutes of The Office. So in Europe, I can go in and say, okay, play the show from the start. And it plays from the start with all the same commercials and everything else. Whereas here, my tendency might be to I guess I missed the first 15 minutes. Maybe I'll catch it on VOD at some point, but just walking away from it. And when you think of it, what's the attraction of watching shows on a Hulu or Netflix, whatever, especially series that you can watch from the beginning. You're not tied down to a schedule as much. I think most people want to watch, especially live TV, within a certain window, within 1 to 3 days of when it airs, just so they can be part of the conversation. But if you give them the option of coming in a couple hours later and doing it from the guide rather than having to go out and find it someplace, that's just a much better experience.
It also calls into question what features you have in-home versus on the go as well, right? I mean, are apps trying to emulate that horrible UX from the VOD model, video on demand model? I don't think so. We're trying to evolve it, right? Christy, are there any features that you think belong on OTT boxes or internet TVs that currently exist in mobile only, on the mobile only side? I mean, are there some things where you're like, that should be here?
I have the world's smallest television, so I sort of forget about this until I go to other people's houses or hotels or wherever, where these giant 55-inch monitors, and I always think, move it over, because there's so much room there to put, I don't need to see necessarily, I mean, I sound like a total old person here, but I don't necessarily need to see this giant screen of all one thing. There really is kind of I'll pick on CNBC. There's all kinds of stuff that you could put on the screen that's very germane to what's happening in the action. And I'm speaking specifically of sports, of course. We have piles of really interesting statistics that are much better understood in a television format, graphics with things moving and heat maps and charts that are changing and numbers that are fluctuating, and representing that in a visual way is really interesting and could make what you're looking at that much more interesting. Time on mat, time in a hold, all this stuff is a very visual display of a bunch of numbers. And that's really the way it should be. So yes, I have all this on this device in my hand, but really it could make for a more compelling television experience as well. And you still can't do that with the cable industry the way it is. We are able to do some of that in the way we can play back that content on other devices, whether it be OTT or the UFC TV app. We've got Newline back there in the corner. Hi. We do some statistical representations within that. It's just really, that's just a matter of technology getting more sophisticated. And speaking of the big data guys next door, it's a massive amount of data that has to be processed immediately and then turned around and represented within seconds so that it makes sense to what's happening on the screen right there. That's incredibly hard to do. So we're all getting better at that, but it's not quite there yet.
I mean, the other big data thing, which you have a difference between mobile and what's on the screen, is that mobile is generally individual accounts as opposed to household accounts. Right. And the amount of data and the value of the data that you can collect from knowing that, okay, it was a woman ages 18 to 24 with these habits and whatnot, who is watching this show and clicking on this ad versus, oh, it's somebody in this household. That's just phenomenal, and we think that is the value of second screen.
Well, and it speaks to also the monetization model, right? Because that's the other thing. I mean, obviously you have a very rich monetization model through your pay-per-view, right? I mean, that's a big ticket item. You get the super fan, and it's a great experience for that purchase.
Sure.
Right? But something like Buddy TV, how do you feel? Where do you guys see the monetization thing going on the ad side, right? Because you're exactly right, Alan, right? The idea that it's mom, it's dad, it's grandma, and little Jimmy, right? We've never been able to determine who is in that living room. It's always like, oh no, this is depending upon who fills out the Nielsen survey, right? It's like, oh no, this is a 35 to 44 male-dominated home, right? When it's absolutely not the case. So I mean, the question I guess is unlocking that. Do you feel that second screen, and this is also a weighted question because this comes to the inevitability of it all, right? Where do you see that going? I mean, is that something that you feel is an integral part of our future in terms of changing the way that we advertise to people?
Well, I just wanted to add on, and I'll come to that question directly. But what's really interesting, we're missing out on this Xbox announcement too. I think it'll be really interesting to see how Google TV, Xbox, and a couple of these manufacturers actually have the potential of overlaying on top of content, and whether or not the content owners will be really ticked off over that, or the MVPDs, or these third-party manufacturers actually allow third parties like Buddy TV or anybody else to be able to overlay second screen content on top of actual content. So perhaps we would be able to provide statistics. Perhaps we may even be able to layer in advertising or even T-commerce and so forth. It enables a whole lot of things, especially if it feels like to the consumer they're getting value out of that experience. If the consumer feels like they're getting value out of that experience, it should actually be a win for everybody, because the content owner now has somebody that will come on and watch that content more and more often. The MVPDs are getting more loyalty from folks that are paying that subscription. And then the third party is building apps that are actually adding value to the consumer ecosystem. And so I'm actually very curious to find out, because my bet is that the Xbox will have some sort of overlay similar to Google TV. Yeah,
Oh, we're not
good.
missing
No,
it yet.
good to
Okay,
know.
good.
Any questions also while we're out there? I know we've probably got about 12 minutes left. anything, you've got three very unique perspectives up here, from technical to obviously to social to.
Yeah, well, the pay-per-view thing is a huge business issue for us and has been forever, in that the way the business works is I, as the content owner of this mixed martial art content, I have no idea who's watching. I sell, market, do huge amounts of effort in education for people to understand the sport, and I never know who bought it, ever. So for us, it's going to be absolutely a game-changing experience to actually distribute some content via some of these over-the-top mobile. We're starting to get about anywhere from 1% to 4% of our audience. We now know who the heck they are, how much of it they watch, when do they actually turn in, when do they turn things off, do they click the links, do they actually look at the statistics, do they send them to each other, do they hashtag things. We didn't know any of this stuff until the last 2-3 years, really, with a big enough audience that we could start to extrapolate some information about that. So for us, for any kind of content owner, it's really going to be a game-changing experience. Take out all the business part of it, just as a content provider, we'll now understand what it is people like about our product directly, so we can make changes and actually make a better product.
Right. And there's still a fear, it's funny, there's still a fear about that from a lot of the MVPDs and networks about knowing, because they already have this capability on a household basis of knowing exactly who's watching what, when, and where. Now, they cling to Nielsen. I always say Nielsen is sort of like, let's make a deal. Like, you've got the Barca Lounger, right? And you could trade it for what's behind the, door number 2, which could be a Mercedes or it could be a rock. And so everybody's really happy to keep the Barca Lounger, because if they actually go away from Nielsen, which everybody knows is inaccurate, but everybody has also agreed to, okay, that's how we're going to sell ads, and we're going to base everything on this. So if they went to actual statistics, that's kind of scary, because they could wind up with the rock. But as second screen becomes more valuable, we think that a lot of it is going to come from the MVPDs or the networks, that they will have their own, basically, whether they buy you guys or use our product or whatever, but it's they will own that second screen, that the program, what you now see, the grid that you see on the screen is going to migrate to the second screen, and that will be how you control your TV, and that's how they'll know who's owning what and who's watching what, and that's when they'll really sort of start to see the value of that data. Flip is that their lawyers are petrified about that. Like, their lawyers don't want them collecting data. They feel there's a lot of privacy issues. No matter how anonymized it is, people still freak out over the notion. I mean, you've seen all these articles about, Target is figuring out that women were pregnant and outing them to their parents. It's like, well, not really. But there's a huge backlash against all this. So there's a push that's going to happen before that goes forward.
Well, you're also talking about disrupting a model that is big money, big business. It's always been, even though it's not a monopoly, right? But it's certainly something that, broadcast television and cable television, and now you're talking about the over-the-top play, and you've got players like Netflix and now Amazon and Google considering making their own content, right? The idea of you or an HBO Go all of a sudden, eking outside of the lines of this established business model it's a threat or it's an opportunity, right? I mean, that's right. The other idea, and it depends on where you sit on that fence, right? This is a great show and of an example of a lot of people who come in and they're like, I've got a great idea, I've got a great technology, and it could totally disrupt. The issue is where do they fit in that transition process? And honestly, from the society's perspective, right, we're trying to, be less disruptive and ease that transition portion of it. Right. But it's really ultimately, it comes back to Gates and content is king, right?
Right. Well, it's going to be interesting to see when Netflix finally releases the House of Cards stats, which they have not done yet. How many people have watched it? And they must know, and they're going to know who and when and where. And will they actually tell us that? Will they release it? Will they use it to try and get, more money from subscribers, money from advertisers or sponsors? A lot of ifs.
Well, go ahead.
The beauty of that whole Netflix model, I don't know if people really appreciate that they outbid HBO for that content. And I actually think that they leveraged their data tremendously. They knew exactly who they needed to target. They knew exactly that these are the guys that consume political thrillers. They knew exactly how much they would consume, and how they had this whole thing predicted out. And in fact, a lot of folks don't appreciate also that for that $100 million, they had no creative, oversight over this thing. It was literally blind, go for it. We're buying it for $100 million, and we're pretty confident based on our data this thing is going to pencil out. So. I'm not a better against Netflix. I think they're onto something pretty powerful.
Well, and as you started to say, is content king or is data king? And I think there's very quickly being a change to that, because if you're going after niche content and you know you can reach that niche audience, then that's not a very scary bet.
Yeah.
So you kind of know how much you can spend because you kind of know who you can reach and who's going to be interested. So the data is,
Well, but it also speaks to convenience, right? Because the whole idea, their whole model, which is genius, of like, no, well, we're putting out all 13 episodes or 12 episodes, day one, boom, done, this is the release date, right? Arrested Development's coming up in a week or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So that whole idea of making it convenient for the consumer, right? So it's like, okay, if you burn through it in the first, 2 days, have a power weekend of House of Cards, right, when it's released, all right, you're going to be sitting around and waiting. The question is will they unsubscribe, right? And then resubscribe? I don't think so, right?
No.
We're a convenience everybody's like, oh, yeah, next, right? Obviously some people will, but that whole convenience factor is also something that plays into that decision and also into the disruption because, frankly, even with, regardless of catch-up TV, right, network television isn't necessarily that convenient. Oh, I got to wait until 9 p.m. to watch this show.
Right. I mean, the flip of that is that, what you hear from a lot of the network people is that, is Netflix losing buzz? In other words, they got buzz for a month or so once all the episodes were released, and then does it drop off compared to, say, a show like Mad Men or Game of Thrones, which have this 6 months worth of buzz, what's going to happen next week, what's going to happen next week. And I don't know the answer, and it's something that'll play out over the next year.
Well, it's shifting models too, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Because instead of releasing 12 shows that are weekly for the season, you can string that out and have a new show every month, and you'd get instant and be like, okay, this one's going to renew next year because you'll know within the first few weeks of and you're not spending the money on the marketing. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. No questions. Everybody. Oh, hey, got a question over here.
Yeah, as I think about convenience versus companion, the experience on the TV can have that companion-based app where you've got live playing and it's the companion nature of Twitter feed, social, the sharing, the shopping. But then you've also got the native app experience, which is coming, and you've also got in the browser embedded within the television. So you have three different experiences. Where do you see the industry trending? And at the end of the day, as a broadcaster or publisher or having all the content of UFC, do you want to just have your own app that is UFC as opposed to relying upon the companion experience from Buddy TV? Do you want to be that companion to the live TV? I mean, there are a couple different plays here, but where's the industry trending?
All right, I got to repeat the question. That's tough. It was a long question. All right, so the idea of having a standalone app versus a convenience app like a Fox Now, where it's like, oh, you open up the Fox app and poof, it's all the Fox stuff. And what was the third one? Oh, television and right,
Browser-based.
browser-based apps on TVs and multiple devices. Where do you guys see it going? That's a great question.
it's a completely data-driven discussion for us. You can make anything now, and really, and especially with cloud development, it's really inexpensive to make a lot of different things. But so what? If you don't know why you're doing it or what you're reacting to in your audience, then you're just kind of making stuff just to make stuff. For us, as the content owner, it's absolutely about the data. Where is our audience? What do they want? If that's why we built our app the way we did. We know clearly that there's 3 distinct experiences for our event. So we built an application that can solve each of those problems. And there's a couple other little whiz bangs in there that deal with things like our fan expos. You can do signatures and that kind of thing. But there's nothing in there that wasn't built without us understanding what our audience actually wanted, considering what's available on platforms now, both in the mobile space and on television. So data drove the decision.
I mean, the browser thing is not happening. So the TV, there's a lot of usability studies that people don't like reading things on TV. We've all tried to hook up our laptop to the TV because we could, and then said, oh God, this is awful. I can't read this. All the big TV manufacturers now are, having rolled that out, are moving away, and they're looking at second screen type experiences to control the TV. There was a couple of them. I think Panasonic had a prototype at CES this year, even to be able to just change the channel and whatnot from a tablet.
And just for the sake of being slightly controversial, our bet is that, number one, I think the primary screen is really meant for the primary screen. I did mention a bunch of things like, hey, you could have third-party apps, overlays, and so forth. We're not betting on that. What we see and what we've tested too is that most people really just want to watch the content. They do want the 70-inch wow HD experience for what they want to watch, and requiring someone to go into a remote control and opening up an app and moving the screen over and then showing things outside of broadcast is very, very difficult. And so our bet is that that's going to stay sacred, and no disrespect to this. Smart TV manufacturers, I just think there's just too much smarts in there that people aren't using. Most people aren't even connecting it to the internet.
Yeah.
Most people have their phones and their tablets and their notebooks connected to the internet. And so our bet is, let's make that experience phenomenal so that they're really enhancing what they're watching on TV. So keep that sacred, focus on this piece, and I think that's really where the war is going to be won. Just to throw another dagger in there, I actually do think Google Glass is another potential application for second screen. I really do think that there is ACR, video ACR, and so forth that could really add a lot of dynamic to watching sports, UFC, or any other sort of application. But again, it's the main screen is the bet, is that it is going to be the primary screen.
And let me also finish that up as well, right? There was that period where it was like, why do we need to start smart TV, right? I want a dumb TV, right? Where it's kind of evolving to from an industry perspective is the way that the device communicates with the television. So Netflix and YouTube are doing the Dial initiative, right? So the idea that you've got an app on your TV that's running the same on your tablet, it allows that communication without having to go through a set-top box or anything else. I think that's also where the smart TV will come back around and be like, it really was smart. Not because people are going to pick up their remote control and try to read a web page on the TV, but it'll interact with your second screen devices in a much more efficient and more seamless way.
Right, you'll start losing the set-top box, which the MVPDs would do cartwheels about, because why do people hate them? Because the cable installer never showed up.
Yeah, true. All right, we've read. Oh, one more question quickly.
Just on from a second screen content creation focus, how do you balance between distracting from the primary content versus enhancing it? Because having a tablet in your lap and you're on the couch watching TV can easily distract you. And if you have a DVR, I'm constantly hitting rewind because I miss what was on TV even though I'm looking at stuff that's with it.
Well, I think that's the element of almost anything you do that's creative, I think, is that I don't get to decide what you like or don't like. All I can do is kind of put out a very easy to use UI, and maybe one of those most important elements is the rewind button, because what I'm doing on this second screen is so compelling. People are going to look, they are going to want to hit pause. Or really, in the case of live television, wouldn't it be cool if you could just stop for a second and see the thing and then go back to it? It doesn't have to be linear. It really doesn't. And I think as people get more and more comfortable with that time shift thing that they have control and can do whatever they want, really as the content provider, our job is to put really compelling stuff out there, and the audience just consumes it however they consume it.
I mean, it also very much depends on the type of content. Like Andy was talking before about how during Lost, people talk about the show after the fact, but not during it, because what if you miss a plot twist? Whereas during a sporting event, people are going to talk about it a lot more, because it mirrors natural, real life behavior, right? People talk during a football game, they shout at the screen. But if you're watching Game of Thrones and someone starts to talk to you, you're like, shh, shh, I might miss something. So I think how that works is going to vary greatly on content, on the type of show, and you will have some things that happen during the show and some that happen after or before. depending.
It's so nascent too. The idea is options, 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 opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. All right, hey, Alan, Andy, Christy, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you guys had a good session, and let's go enjoy lunch.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you.